Tonight, it's no secret that our public finances are in crisis, so is the solution to dramatically increase how much we all pay for vital services? We've brought together a panel of experts to assess the options that politicians somewhere, at some stage, will need to make a call on. And it's been a busy week at Westminster with a reshuffle, a broadside attack on the PM by his former Home Secretary, and big resignations from the Labour front bench. We'll get the latest from London and ask where all of that leaves the government's talks with the DUP. Hello. In September, the Secretary of State warned that revenue-raising measures would be required to address the huge shortfall in public finances here. Departments identified a short list of possible options, and on Chris Heaton-Harris's instructions, some of those are now out for public consultation. In just a moment, we'll discuss those with our panel, but first, Darren Marshall sets out the options and how much money they could bring in.
We're better to explain hypothetical revenue-raising options than in my fictional village. The big ticket item is water charges. Introducing those could raise up to £350 million.
In May, hospital parking charges are due to be abolished. That was a decision taken by politicians at Stormont. Keep them in place and you keep 10 million in the pot. Prescription charges were abolished back in 2010. Reintroduce those, an extra 20 million. Domiciliary care is provided for free in Northern Ireland. Start charging for that and you could bring in £32 million. The rateable value of homes is capped. That means larger properties in more affluent areas pay the same rates as more modest detached properties. So remove that cap in its entirety and you could raise £11 million. And it's not just homes that could face increased rates. Businesses could too. Currently, factories here get a 70% discount on their rates bill. Scrap that and you may raise £70 million. And then there are tuition fees. Increasing those and aligning the student loan repayment period with that in England could add £90 million.
There are a couple of other smaller measures, but taken as a whole, this could generate around £600 million. But these are just ballpark figures, and it's possible that once they're turned into actual policies, they could bring in less money than hoped. Stormont's deficit this year is £450 million, and if pay awards matching those in the rest of the UK are introduced, that would balloon to £1 billion.
At the moment, these decisions are out for consultation, and the decisions won't be easy. Each of them will impact our pocket at a time when we're already dealing with a cost of living crisis. But ultimately, it's for politicians to decide, be that at Stormont or Westminster.
Darren Marshall there. Let's get some analysis of that with my studio panel. John Campbell is our economics and business editor. Dr. Lisa Wilson is an economist and a former member of the Fiscal Commission. Dr. Ciara Fitzpatrick is a poverty campaigner and lecturer at Ulster University. Susan Fitzgerald is Regional Secretary of the Unite Trade Union. And Dr. Andrew McCormick is a former Permanent Secretary at the Department of Enterprise. Welcome to all of you and thanks for joining us on the programme tonight. Same question for all of you really, just to get us started. Andrew McCormick, first of all, is it right that revenue raising is now up for discussion? Could paying more help to solve Northern Ireland's financial problems?
It could help. It's not a magic bullet. There are lots of other options that need to be considered as well, but revenue raising, it's essential it's considered. When the public finances are in such a crisis, the scale of the deficit is so high, every option needs to be considered. And the other thing is, we're asking for more from the Treasury. We've been asking for more for decades. I spent a large part of my career asking for more from the Treasury, and they will not listen while we have such a low level of revenue compared to poor areas of England.
And just very briefly, in terms of the overall portfolio of ideas that might need to be considered, what else needs to be thought of alongside revenue raising? So
efficiency in public service delivery, that includes the concepts of transformation and reform, which are much talked about and not implemented. Yes, asking for more is important. Actually then examining, is everything we're providing essential? Taking a very hard look at the range of public services. We have high expectations and that's totally understandable, but we really need to look hard at what's possible.
That would involve an awful lot of very hard conversations and difficult decisions, wouldn't it? Susan Fitzgerald, do you think it's right that revenue raising is on the table for discussion?
I think what's on the table for discussion from the Secretary of State is an attempt to weaponise and leverage suffering for workers and communities. I started my day this morning supporting some of the most important people in our society, education support workers who are on the picket line. These are women and men, many of whom, as we just seen, are having to have 2 and 3 jobs just to survive. They're taking strike action to defend a failing service, trying to survive in that context, and they're absolutely adamant that they're not going to take the burden of further stell taxes, which will make it near impossible for them to survive and pay their bills. So he can put all the proposals he wants. My union, and I know it'll be the same for others, will actively mobilise to make sure that they're not implemented.
Ciara Fitzpatrick, right or wrong that it's even on the table?
I mean, it's all well and good to talk about revenue raising, but we cannot ignore the economic context that we're currently living in, particularly in Northern Ireland. We have stagnating public sector wages. The incomes in Northern Ireland are around 10% lower than they are in the rest of the UK. We have a discretionary income, according to the Consumer Council in Northern Ireland, for the lowest income households of about £18.63 per month after they pay for all their essential bills. So, I mean, where are the households getting the money for these charges? As well as that, we can't ignore how behind we are in certain areas of public policy. So we know that middle-income households are already being squeezed by raises in mortgage interest, and we also know that they're being squeezed by the ludicrous cost of childcare, because we do not get the same childcare provision in Northern Ireland. There is no free 30 hours that are available in the rest of the UK. There's no childcare strategy at all. So we have to see that our households are in a desperate position as it is. OK,
I'm sure we'll talk about childcare because that's a very important issue in a bit more detail later in this conversation. Lisa Wilson, you're an economist. Should revenue raising be on the table?
I think the entire conversation, as Chris Heaton-Howard is playing it out, is really call into question the very point of devolution in its very instance. If it's in a conversation for Chris Heaton-Harris to suggest that we need to, as a society, get rid of areas of policy divergence, because that's what these areas are. These are areas of policy divergence in which the Northern Ireland Executive in the past has made decisions on which to spend our money differently. And if we are going to say no, as Northern Ireland Secretary of State, I'm going to suggest that, I don't like the way you've been spending your money, and rather I want you to start raising money in this way because I don't like what you've been doing until now. It really questions the entire notion of devolution. And that point that Ciara made, as soon as you start to talk about the areas of super parity and the areas of which, we're not raising as much money as what other places are, we need to talk about those areas of sub-parity, those areas in policy where we're not getting the same as what our counterparts are in England. And the two key areas are childcare and public sector pay deals. We are not delivering the same provision of services. So those are the two big things that we need to consider when we're talking about this.
OK, we've had 4 very differing opinions already around this table. John Campbell, I want you just to sum up and give us an overview, if you would, first of all, because it seems that revenue raising is up for discussion, whether people like it or not, because the Secretary of State has asked for these consultations to take place, and they're now beginning to take place. But is it really on the table? Will it ever happen?
I think there's a couple of ways you can come at this. Firstly, if Stormont was to come back, we would have new ministers in place, and they wanted to reach a new deal with the Treasury. As Andrew was suggesting, tactically, it's highly likely there would have to be at least some movement on revenue raising, because you look, for example, at places such as the northeast of England and Wales, which on some measures are worse off than Northern Ireland. So the Treasury will, of course, say there, well, if you want a better deal in terms of equity, you need to move closer to what those parts of the UK do in terms of things like rates and water charges. That will realistically be part of the conversation. But I think we've also heard important views here about how much will actually be raised in practice, because we get the headline figure usually off it's 350 million for water charges. You pull everything together, you might easily get 600 or 700 million. But I don't think that really engages with what will this actually look like in policy terms when it arrives. For example, would you expect that people who are on benefits will pay the full whack for water charges, or would there have to be some sort of social tariff? And even the consultations we've seen so far, for example, saying that we could raise £11 million by abolishing the valuation cap on rates. If we were to just abolish the valuation cap entirely, that would mean some very wealthy households in Northern Ireland would be paying £25,000 a year in rates, which would be about 5 times what the most expensive houses in England pay. So it feels to me politically unlikely that that's going to happen. So you wouldn't raise the full 11 million there on paper. Same as removing the rates rebate for manufacturing, so they get 70% off their rates. I don't think that politically any minister is going to come along and say to all of manufacturing, you're paying 70% more from next year. That would be phased in over time. So you're not going to, in year one, raise anything like £70 million. So I think we need to treat a lot of the numbers which are flying about and will be flying about with a deal of caution. There's probably not going to be enough there to fill the sort of size of overspend we're talking about, but the politics of it are that tactically local ministers, when they return, would need to at least make some gesture towards revenue raising, I think.
Yeah, quite a lot of nodding around the table. Andrew, I want to just pick up on what John was talking about there. When you look at some of the numbers that Darren Marshall outlined for us there, I mean, they're quite interesting headline figures, but as John rightly says, when you actually dig behind them a little bit, the chances of raising those sums of money, if this is rolled out, are actually quite slim. And that's the reality. So some people might look at this and say, well, there's an awful lot of pain involved for an awful lot of people. There's an awful lot of cost in actually implementing these changes. And the dividend at the end of the day is nothing like what some people say it will be. That's the hard reality.
That's a very hard reality. I think the focus needs to be on, if the issue is just raising money, then look at big ticket items that can produce substantial, make a difference. And
so like water charges?
Water charges, rates, student fees probably gets into that. Passes that test as being big enough.
Well, rates is an interesting one. £350 million is the figure that's knocked about a lot for water charges. But actually, when you pick at that, it's nothing like £350 million in all probability. But the rates there, I mean, the domestic cap, if it's scrapped altogether, as John says, would raise £11 million. Industrial derating would raise £70 million. But those two figures would add up to £81 million if you got them instantly. But you're not going to get anything like that, even if you go down this road.
So I think it's important to look at this in the context of what feels fair, and it might be coming over to the public as recognising some of the realities that the others have talked about, because we do have massive issues in our society and our economy. So finding ways that make it clear that the greatest burden is falling on those most able to pay, and that there are very strong protections for those least able to pay. That has to be part of any deal that is worked out here. There are ways to do that, but
it's not just about the cosmetics. It's not just about lifting the cap on domestic rates to make it look good. It also has to be of some practical purpose, doesn't it? And if it's raising a tiny amount of money, you'd have to ask if it's actually fulfilling any purpose.
It's also a relatively easy thing to change because the system is our rating system is more progressive, fairer in that sense, and also more. It can be adapted. It doesn't need to be slavishly following practice across the water.
Do you accept John's point that it would not be fair for somebody to be paying £25,000 in rates here when the top rates across the water are something in the region of £6,000?
So that's where devolution kicks in. It's for local politicians to judge what is fair in our society rather than following parity. That's not what devolution is about. Devolution does mean discretion to do things differently. And if one of the questions in consultation says, can you think of other things, other ways in which money could be raised? So we don't have to only follow the patterns that are from across the water. The way things are at the moment, we have a major Achilles heel in our arguments when we're asking for more, which is, why are you paying so little overall if you look at the aggregates of all these things.
Lisa, looking at this from an economist's perspective, do you accept the line that we are paying less for our services here in Northern Ireland than people across the water are paying?
I think the entire conversation around the super priority areas has been framed as though Northern Ireland is a complete basket case when it comes to our public finances.
As if we're living off the fat of the land and the taxpayer in GB is paying for it.
When in reality what is happening is that Northern Ireland politicians in the past have made decisions to spend money differently. And as a result, we haven't been raising revenue on these things. So to take an example of that, we'll take water as an example. What happens in effect, and where the 345 million figure comes from, is that the Department for Infrastructure gives NI Water 345 million and that was the figure for 21, to fund NI Water. That doesn't mean that whenever we come to a final charge model, should we decide to charge citizens for water, that we would raise that because of the points raised about the fact that we'd need to make it a progressive system, we'd need to recognise that other people, some people don't have any ability to pay. But the point about this is that Northern Ireland isn't unique here in the terms of the shambles in which public finances are in. We're seeing similar conversations in Wales. We're seeing Birmingham Council going into bankruptcy. There is an entire conversation about the state of the UK public finances, which is where the nut and crux of this all effectively lies. And we're kind of having this long conversation about super priority and revenue raise and what can we get from that and what can we get from the other, when really we need to start having the conversation about how can we fix the UK public finance settlement and deliver public services which people expect.
I want to talk about because we've talked about the politicians who ultimately would be involved in this decision-making process. We know that devolution at Stormont is in hiatus at the moment because of the DUP's continuing boycott of the institutions, but it was interesting when we spoke to each of the five main parties and asked them for their views on what might be involved in revenue raising. I mean, Susan, Sinn Féin sent us a statement which amounts to a sweeping rejection of revenue raising, not dissimilar to yours, saying that this kind of revenue raising should not be on the table. The party said the government has ignored the Fiscal Commission's recommendations to devolve powers to the North, which would enable us to consider progressive ways to raise revenue to fund public services. What are, in your view, progressive ways to raise revenue? Sinn Féin didn't give any examples, but what might they be? Is there, in your view, such a thing at all, in fact? Mary,
who Lisa works for, have published chapter and verse about progressive revenue raising that doesn't go back to overburdened working people again and again. But I have to say, I find this whole discussion skewed. Chris Heaton-Harris is a minister in the UK government. The UK economy is worth £2.5 trillion and is growing. Yet we're having a discussion about making up taxes, because water charges is a made-up stealth tax. People are already paying through their rates, and going back to already overburdened workers and people not working in our society. It's sociopathic to talk about introducing prescription charges. Ciara said that in average the income after you pay everything, £18. And if you have to get three scripts.
But some people could afford to be paying prescription charges. I think Andrew McCormick's point is that those with the broad shoulders to be able to pay for what they're currently not paying for might be asked to do so.
The money is there. So do
you not think anybody should be paying for prescription charges?
No, I don't think. I think health and education and all these things should be free at source. And that, to be honest, it's completely. We've seen super profits. We've seen profiteering on a scale not experienced in years and years. Public sector workers are, when you take into account inflation, are on the same pay they were on in 1999 in reality. And we're talking about going back to working people, and they should put their hand in their pocket again. The money isn't there, and the patience isn't there, more importantly. So you can have a discussion about what you can raise. But actually, I don't think you can do it. I don't think you can do it through tuition fees. I think young people are suffering enough, and you won't be able to do it through water charges. Politicians and everyone else was told decisively in 2007 that attitude hasn't changed. And prescription charges, we should just all be absolutely disgusted at the mere suggestion of that, and attacking older workers' right to travel free and transport. All these things are in the mix.
Charges may actually be a waste of time, to be honest, because if you look
I think the figure's about 20 million, isn't it?
Because if you look in England where they have them, there's a whole bunch of exemptions for certain people, depending on their conditions, what they earn and all the rest of it. You'd also have to have some sort of system to administer it, to make sure there's not fraud, to check the prescription charges, all the rest of it. And by the time you factor all that in, would you even break even on prescription charges? I don't know. So I think that it's one of the ones when you really start to analyse it, you think, well, this is barely worth a candle, to be honest.
Yeah.
This is one of the other things, just to bring into the mix as well, about how this is so difficult, is when you look at the work that the Fiscal Commission did and previous work, effectively it says that the only substantial amount of tax that you could raise in Northern Ireland would be by devolving income tax and raising the basic rate. Nothing else would really move the needle very much. So if you were to devolve income tax and increase the top rate, there aren't enough high income people in Northern Ireland to actually make much difference. So that would again, even if you, as Sinn Féin kind of alluded towards Fiscal Commission, if you followed what the Fiscal Commission was effectively telling us, it still probably wouldn't be very pleasant for most people, because you're basically saying basic rate of tax has to go up.
That's a very interesting point, and some people may be nervous about giving our politicians even more powers if they were to come back to Stormont than they have at the moment or had previously. But that, I suspect, is a conversation for another day. I want to pick up on the issue of industrial derating and bring in Stephen Kelly from Manufacturing NI, who joins us from our Foyle studio. Stephen, evening to you, and thanks for joining us. I just was talking about what Sinn Féin had said. We asked Alliance for its views. It does provide some examples of what progressive ways to raise revenues might look like, particularly devolving stamp duty and landfill tax. But interestingly, the party says it supports a review of the industrial derating system to ensure it's fair, progressive, fit for purpose, and it supports economic growth. We're open to reviewing the level of industrial derating, but further analysis is required in this regard by an incoming finance minister. Are you extremely concerned at the prospect of the removal of industrial derating? Do you think it would have a big impact as far as your members are concerned?
Well, Mark, we would be. Already this week, since the consultation's been announced, I've had a number of phone calls, a number of conversations with manufacturers across Northern Ireland. They're concerned about whether they invest in that big shed that they've been planning to expand their business. They're concerned about the additional cost that this would bring. For some of our larger manufacturers, Spirit Aerosystems, for instance, it's a £1.5 million worth of additional cost, £500,000 at Wrightbus, £500,000 at Caterpillar. These are jobs that are really at the centre of communities across Northern Ireland. And the reality in business is that once you start to input these additional taxes, because that's what they are, they're not inoffensive revenue-raising measures, they're additional taxation that businesses need to endure, then businesses need to find an alternative route to recover that money. And what we've found in the past, when this was first, when business rates were first applied to manufacturing properties back in the early 2000s, it meant that some manufacturers just left this place. And at a time whenever we need as many people in jobs as possible, jobs that are better paid, creating wealth across Northern Ireland, more than half the jobs in Mid-Ulster, almost half the jobs in Armagh, Banbridge, Craigavon, almost half the jobs in Mid and East Antrim, then the way you do that is actually provide an environment for those entrepreneurs to go and create those jobs, rather than actually making this a cold place for people to do business. Well, that's interesting, a cold place for people to do business. I mean, just to explain to people, currently factories here get a 70% discount on their rates. That's a policy which has been in place for about a century or thereabouts. Ending it could raise something in the region of £70 million, apparently. Are you saying that if that was changed, if it was phased out over a period of time, you would fear that manufacturing companies in Northern Ireland, which are providing jobs here and incomes for people, would think about, for example, moving their business across the border? Well, we know that that's already happened whenever the 30% cap was actually put in place. It went from 0 to 30%, and some businesses made that choice. I've been speaking to people already this week that are already questioning their investments that they have here, or particularly their future investments, which will make them sticky. The reality for those guys is that when you add so much more additional cost, you need to find a more efficient way to do it than to do your business, then you have to make those tough choices and tough decisions. So the way to sort our public finances isn't by taxing those jobs and those wealth creators in Northern Ireland. We have a really incoherent approach here. I mean, there's talk in the press today that the Chancellor's going to reduce taxation elsewhere in the UK next week. Even the Secretary of State froze the regional rate earlier this year, but yet they're talking about trying to raise these additional revenues, this additional taxation. We need a really stable environment where people were secure about what investments they're going to make, and when they are, jobs are created and wealth's created right across Northern Ireland.
OK, Stephen, for now, thanks very much indeed. Ciara, I just want to bring you in again. The DUP, when we spoke to the party, rejects revenue raising in this format, arguing the method of allocating funds to Northern Ireland is flawed as it currently stands. And the party says the Barnett formula by which monies are allocated to Northern Ireland needs to be fixed, and with or without an executive pressure will only increase if that is not fixed. The underfunding gap will increase each year, the party says. Do you think that the DUP has a point there, that we need to reassess how funds are allocated to Northern Ireland? And would you argue that we need to look at the Welsh model, where it is on the basis of need?
Yes, absolutely. Look, the DUP have a point there. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The Barnett formula needs to be renegotiated. It needs to be on the basis of need.
It took 10 years to do that for Wales, of course.
Well, exactly. And the rich thing about the DUP's statement is that they're out of government. So while they're out of government, there's no negotiations happening and there's no discussions happening around how we improve our public services. And then the reality is that you listen to Dr. Alan Stout, who was on the radio this week, saying that the wait for a first appointment is 80 weeks, which you're not getting in the UK. We are facing a crisis in social care, where there was a man on the BBC News this week who couldn't access domiciliary care. I talked to families in Lisburn today who are being pressured to do more hours of work. They're in part-time work. They're being encouraged to up their hours to at least 30 hours. They've got children and they can't access the same kind of childcare that they can in the rest of the UK. So it comes back to what Lisa is saying around subparity and those distinct areas of need that are currently not being serviced by our current Barnett formula negotiation.
Andrew, is that right? Do you agree with that? Does the Barnett formula need to be renegotiated to the benefit of people in Northern Ireland?
The Barnett formula is totally corny and anachronistic. It was introduced as an expedient for a couple of years and has lasted for over 40. It's wrong in many ways, but it is still a matter for the UK government. Is what determines the distribution. And what they say is, for most of the time up to now, we've had well above, maybe 10, 20% above need based on comparison. And that's bringing together everything. Yes, of course, the point of devolution is to say, here is a budget. Within that budget, you can do whatever you want, but setting the total has to be looked at in a way that is fair across the UK. So I can recall a Chief Secretary who was probably, he was probably to the left of most of the members in our Assembly, and he was saying, why should my constituents in a poor area of London pay more in a way that is not paid in Northern Ireland? That was a Labour Chief Secretary of the Treasury saying, you can't have any more money because you're not paying enough in Northern Ireland. They have the power to determine the allocation. The formula is rubbish. It takes no account of need. So yes, looking at a need element, as in Wales, is an important step.
Yes.
But we have to recognise that we've had a lot of high expenditure for decades.
Yeah, some people might say, with the greatest respect to that individual and his constituents in London, they did not live through a civil war for 30 years and they don't have the sort of problems that people here are experiencing on an ongoing basis. John, I want to just raise one point and introduce an individual who's come back into the news and get your thoughts on that. This issue of revenue raising has been a discussion here on and off for a very long time. David Cameron re-emerged onto the political front line this week, and it's very interesting just to look back at what he had to say on the subject to Jeremy Paxman as far back as April 2010. That's over 13 years ago, just before he became Prime Minister.
You have said specifically that in some parts of the country, the state accounts for a bigger share of the economy than it did in the communist countries in the old Eastern Bloc. This is clearly unsustainable.
Correct.
Which parts of the country?
Well, the first one I think I'd pick out is Northern Ireland. I mean, in Northern Ireland, it's quite clear, and almost every party, I think, now accepts this, that the size of the state has got too big. We need a bigger private sector.
Well, it's interesting. He's now back around the cabinet table.
Yeah, I do remember that because that was, I think, in the middle of the election campaign where the Conservatives had hooked up with the Ulster-Unionists and basically hold them below the waterline in the middle of an election campaign, for which David Cameron probably wasn't thanked locally. It is somewhat ironic, though. You have David Cameron, one of the architects of austerity, so him and George Osborne setting out to shrink the state. So we're in a position where austerity has delivered, demonstrably worse public services across the whole of the UK, but the state isn't actually any smaller because the tax take as a percentage of GDP is the highest it's been in 50 years. So it is, in some ways you could say David Cameron is returning to the scene of the crime here. There's I think an increasing economic consensus that austerity did not work even on its own terms in that regard.
Susan, I've got to let you respond to that. I imagine that David Cameron's probably not on your Christmas card list, and when you're reminded of that from 13 years ago, he's unlikely to find his way onto it. Am I right?
I've just ordered Christmas cards, actually, both for workers and people actually striving to defend their services, not the people who benefit from wrecking them and have the gall to re-enter the stage of history when they're actually really bankrupt. On the picket line this morning, I found it harrowing, I have to tell you. I was speaking to workers, a lot of women workers who are support staff. They are responsible in a special school in East Belfast. They were telling me about their day. They tube feed children. They medically care for children who have choking hazards, all in a day's work, and they're some of the most underpaid. I just want to make a point about this, Mark, because there's an air of unreality about Chris Heaton-Harris, about some of the footage here. But one of the women, she wouldn't let me leave the picket line today because she knew I was coming on tonight, and she wanted to put a challenge to Chris Heaton-Harris to spend 1 hour in her school and see the failure of our services because they're only surviving because of working people. The measures that are being talked about and the approach of this government will destroy them. And actually, the parties here are not strong enough to stop that. They can't come together. It's going to come down to working people and ordinary people in our society if we have to have any kind of a chance for all of us, and particularly our most vulnerable.
OK, that's an interesting note to end this conversation on. I wish we had more time. We had a lot of time, but there seems to be an awful lot more that we could talk about. But we'll get you back again, and we'll do that at another stage. But I think it's a really interesting conversation. We're going to hear a lot more of it in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in to join us tonight. Now, let's move on to events at Westminster. It's been a challenging week for Rishi Sunak and his government. His patience ran out with his strong-willed Home Secretary, and she departed the Cabinet, leaving no one in any doubt about her views on the Prime Minister's abilities. On top of that, of course, the Supreme Court dealt a blow to the Tories' controversial Rwanda policy, and the Labour front bench was divided over calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. I'm joined now from London by Gerry Scott, who's senior political correspondent at The Times. Gerry, evening to you, and thanks for joining us tonight. So it's goodbye to Suella Braverman and welcome back to Dave Cameron. What do you think's behind Rishi Sunak's thinking, and could it work?
Well, look, I think Suella Braverman was probably going to go regardless of what has happened in the last couple of weeks. If you track what has happened in the last year, there have been various points at which the Prime Minister and his former Home Secretary have clashed, so I don't think that was necessarily a surprise. But if you're asking about Rishi Sunak's thinking with David Cameron, I think, look, we're a year, if not less, out from the election. He wants someone in who has experience, who has kind of gravitas on the world stage, especially in the geopolitical climate that we're in. Feels like he could do with that experience. But look, don't be in any doubt, the Tory MPs I've spoken to in the last few days have said to me that they're quite insulted. They feel like the message is that they don't feel like there's anyone good enough in the party to do that job, and it's not necessarily gone brilliantly for him.
Yeah. Do you think Suella Braverman is more or less dangerous as far as the Prime Minister is concerned on the Tory backbenches as opposed to sitting around the cabinet table?
I don't think she's dangerous this side of the election. I don't think we're going to see any kind of leadership moves against Rishi Sunak this side of the election. I think what we're looking at really is the post-election bun fight for the heart and soul of the party, where Suella Braverman will particularly become dangerous if you are a moderate Conservative, for example. So there is going to be a fight for the party after the election, because if you believe the polls, and most of us do, the Conservatives are going to lose, Labour's going to win, and then you have this kind of struggle for what the party represents, what it's all about. Some of that will come from the centre, some of it will come from the right. What it looks like at the moment is Suella Braverman's going to be that right candidate, and that's really where we're looking for her danger to be. I don't think she's going to be a massive problem for the Prime Minister this side of the election, but to be clear, that doesn't mean that she's going to be quiet or not make interventions like we've seen her do in the Telegraph this evening.
Yeah. Chris Heaton-Harris, of course, remains in place. I don't know if that's testament to his abilities or to the wider cabinet mathematics. Just very quickly, do you think very many people sitting around that cabinet table are likely to be at all interested in the conversation we've been having here for the last half hour about the dire finances of Northern Ireland PLC?
The short answer is no. If I'm honest, the longer answer is that anything that doesn't kind of play to the electorate in the next few months is going to be on the agenda. It's why we're hearing so much about Rwanda and immigration. It's why we're going to hear things on tax and other topics like that. I don't think we're going to hear too much about any other important subjects, to be clear, very important subjects, but that aren't necessarily exciting in the next few weeks and months. And I think we saw that in the King's speech that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. It was very slimmed down. Around half of the bills in it were either carryover bills, things that had been previously proposed, or draft bills. It's a very slim legislative agenda in the next few months, and I really don't think we're going to see much beyond what the government thinks are going to win the election.
And Jerry, would you include in that the ongoing discussions, which seem to have gone a bit cold, let's be honest, between the government and the DUP about the Windsor framework and where we go with the Irish Sea border, which is such a problem for the DUP, and the reason why, apparently, we don't have a functioning Stormont at the moment?
Yeah, I would include that in that. And I'm not hearing much chat about it. And look, I want to be clear, it's not my area of expertise. So I'm not saying that I would necessarily have an inside track on that. But I do think what we're going to see in the coming months is things that the Conservatives think will win an election. And I'm not necessarily sure that that is something that they would be like inserting into their manifesto that they think is a massive election winning promise. Yeah. So I think it's probably off the table for the moment.
And just in a sentence, if you would, not a good week for Labour with those MPs and 10 members of the front bench rebelling over a ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, it's not been a great couple of days for Keir Starmer, but I think it could have gone a lot worse for him. Sources I've spoken to in the last couple of days told me they thought the rebellion would be bigger. It's not as bad as it could have been. It is a challenge to his authority, but to his wider leadership, not so much. It's a niche issue.
OK, got to leave it there. Jerry, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's all we've got time for tonight. You can catch this programme on iPlayer. You can join me this weekend for Sunday Politics at the usual time of 10 o'clock here on BBC One, when I'll be talking to the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. For now, though, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good night from all of us. Bye-bye.